in, a Trumpian direction, or some other kind of, major shakeup on the Western stage, or maybe Zelensky getting killed or something that just completely changes the calculus. But even if he doesn't get that kind of a Hail Mary, a single big breakthrough, I think he's prepared to keep fighting over, 10 kilometers here and 10 kilometers there, so that the areas of Ukraine that he considers most historically pro-Russian or Russian would wind up in the Russian Federation. The Black Sea coast would wind up in the Russian Federation. A land bridge to Crimea would remain within Russia. And, his best ambition would be to get Kyiv, which of course is sort of the founding city of both Russia and Ukraine. And in that sense, is older than Moscow, as I understand the history, and, equally important to Putin than probably Moscow or St. Petersburg. And so Putin's best dream would be to get that too, or at a minimum, make sure that any future government in Kyiv is at least as compliant with Russia as Lukashenko is in Belarus. But even if he doesn't get those, more grandiose goals, I think he's prepared, like a leader of World War I Europe, prepared to spend many months, if not years, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of his own people and, several percent of GDP to try to slog out whatever territorial gains he can achieve. So I think General Clark has the right, ambition or aspiration, but I'm not sure it really speaks to Putin's state of mind.
And speaking of the state of mind, against that's the state of statistics, and you're a statistician to some extent, I guess, the number of people, it's always mystifying to me because we never know exactly how many died on both sides. Do you have any feel for those numbers? How many dying on the Russian side and Ukrainian side, or Russian plus friends?
Well, I don't have any feel, but I study the reports.
Yeah.
I don't have any firsthand feel or gut instinct. Yeah. And the latest data that we've seen suggested about 200,000 Russian casualties so far. That includes wounded. So out of that total, that probably implies 40 to 50,000 dead. Mm-hmm. And then on the Ukrainian side, about half that number of military casualties, or maybe a little more than that, but also another up to 40,000 civilians killed. And so in that sense, the Ukrainians have probably lost more people if you add military and civilian together, because there aren't really any Russian civilians dying in this war, but there are a lot of Ukrainian civilians. But Russia's more prepared to sacrifice its own manpower. And for us Americans, it's sort of evocative of our history of the American Civil War, where the North had about a 4-to-1 advantage in manpower over the South. And General Ulysses S. Grant realized that. And so by the last year of the war, even though it was very unpleasant, he kept being willing to engage in battle after battle after battle against the Confederacy and the forces of General Robert E. Lee, even though it was very costly in lives on both sides and even more costly in Union lives. Grant knew that was the best path to win the war, and ultimately the numbers would be on his side. I think Putin has a similar kind of calculus in a somewhat different situation, because of course the Confederacy did not have any major outside backers, and Ukraine does. So for that reason, we can hope that Ukraine can withstand this. But I believe Putin's calculus is not too different in sort of narrow military terms from General Grant's calculus in the American Civil War. He's just going to keep grinding away, and he's willing to pay a very high price for what he sees as sort of the future of, the contest between East and West. I mean, Ukraine is where that contest has occurred for centuries, and Putin's not about to lose it, not about to lose Ukraine, come what may.
And with 13 months to look back over, we said it hasn't been a great victory on the military side. But as a chess player, how would you rate Putin?
Well, I thought he was good until last year. I thought that he, was impressive, a callous, brutal man, but nonetheless a pretty good chess player. For example, when he intervened in Syria, he had spent 4 years watching the United States not get involved in the Syrian civil war, and sort of reading every specific step and every speech that President Obama would give, where sometimes Obama claimed that we would ensure, regime transformation in Syria. but Putin took stock of what the United States was actually willing to do. And he realized that Obama was not interested in taking chances, paying a very high price, thought that Assad would fall anyway, just didn't really have any interest in the second term of his presidency being an American president who would focus on foreign military operations. And so by 2015, Putin had figured out Obama, maybe in some ways better than Obama understood himself. And I thought Putin was, if nothing else, a very good chess player, to use your phrase. But this all turned that upside down for me, because I just don't see, you got to have a particularly twisted, warped view of the world to think that this war is worth it. And unfortunately, I believe that Putin does have that twisted, warped view, as I just said a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any particularly strong analytical case for backing that up. Russia's already far and away the biggest country on earth. It already has tremendous resources. Why would you sacrifice your access to the broader world economy? Why would you stymie your people's ability to, again, achieve the greatness that it's historically often displayed in science and mathematics and engineering and all the things that require interaction with the outside world? But Putin's throwing all that away for a generation of Russians. So I don't think, his calculus is really particularly defensible, and therefore I can't call him a very good chess player. He is following perhaps, his own priorities. He is developing policy based on those own priorities, but the priorities are so misplaced as to make me think that he's not as smart of a guy as I used to believe.
Yeah, we'll go into China in a second because that's part of the conversation, but I just want to open it up for questions. If there's anybody among the viewers right now that want to pop in here and ask a question, I'm entirely open to. Anybody out there?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Michael, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Likewise, great to see you.
I want to roll back to the micro question in U.S. tactics about the gradual approach to arming the Ukrainians. There's sort of two arguments. I think you mentioned both of them. One, or maybe you didn't, but people mentioned one is fear of escalating, giving them too many weapons that would be a problem with Russia. The other is give them weapons that they have the capability to actually use because of these technical issues of if they know how to fly these kind of planes or those kind of planes, and do you have the ammunition for the HIMARS and those sorts of issues. I'm just curious because you look at this in detail. Do you think both were equally important in the slow movement of military support, or do you think the fear of looking like we're escalating was more or less important than the actual logistical and mechanical aspects of it?
I think that logistically, for the first 6 months of the war, there was an argument in favor of going slowly and addressing the most acute need and making sure the Ukrainians could nail that, javelins and stingers in the early days, and then an ability to sustain communications and get a better picture of the battlefield, and then the HIMARS. So the first 6 months of our decision-making, I have no real issue with. And also, as we discussed earlier, making sure the Russians wouldn't escalate, that they would sort of get used to this, sort of like the frog in the boiling water or the frog in the gradually warming water that never quite notices it's being heated and winds up dead because, it never sensed an obvious change and therefore didn't get out of the water. Well, I think, Biden had some understandable concerns that Russia might escalate. And so I have no criticism of that. Also, we didn't really know how well the Ukrainians could fight in this period. And we had seen problems in the development of their armed forces in the previous 8 years. By the end of the summer of 2022, however, I think we knew that Ukraine could absorb a lot, that the war was not going to be quickly decided, and that we needed to start, therefore, getting more strategic about how we would support Ukraine, develop a package and a suite of capabilities that would maximize its prospects on the battlefield. So I become more critical of Biden by, let's say, the late fall. And in fact, that's the first time I wrote. I had been in Ukraine in September, and I advocated upon my return, some increases in certain capabilities. But I didn't have a big issue at that point. I thought that Ukraine needed tanks, but that seemed like the decision the Biden administration would come to next. But then it took them 4 or 5 months, and we didn't think the Abrams was a good choice, but we understood pretty quickly that if we would just give some Abrams, then, that would unleash the Leopard tank stream from our European allies. And yet it took us a long time to make that decision. And I don't think that was smart. We should have used the winter time to help the Ukrainians get those tanks and train on those tanks. That would have been long enough to get them in pretty good shape. These are people who know how to operate armored equipment. They are people who know how to conduct a certain amount of combined arms maneuver warfare. But they needed a few months to learn how to operate these particular systems, learn how to maintain them, establish maintenance facilities and depots, establish supply lines for spare parts coming in from the West, even beyond the initial provisioning of the systems themselves. All of that should have been happening full bore throughout the winter, because the natural time to want to be ready would be spring. And now it turns out we're going to need the spring to do a lot of that transferring and training. And then we're not even going to have the fighter jet debate really until maybe the summer. So I think that increases the odds that this will be at least another 2 years of war. And I'm not suggesting Ukraine will ever win back all of its territory, but I think we sort of owe them the chance to try. And so my view is that, the tanks and maybe some attack helicopters should have been provided early in the winter. And in fact, my understanding was that that debate was already well underway in the fall. But then I think the Biden administration sort of threw sand in the gears at that point. So I become more critical of them as the war continues onward, as 2022 winds down. As for the fighter jets, we had General C.Q. Brown here at Brookings last month. He's the chief of staff of the U.S. Air Force. And I didn't want to grill him too much about Ukraine because it's not really his area of responsibility. He's in charge of training and equipping the American Air Forces. But I did say, I don't want to talk too much about Ukraine, General, but can you tell me roughly how long it would take, do you think, for a pilot to get trained on an F-16? And he said, in the U.S. Armed Forces, it takes 2 to 4 months typically to learn how to fly a new aircraft when you're already a pilot and you got to fly a new type of aircraft based off that experience. And so, the maintenance may be more complicated than the actual flying. And I understand the counter argument about F-16s. I probably lean more towards providing attack helicopters and then, making all of our willingness to keep providing spare parts and munitions contingent on Ukraine not attacking Russian territory. But I think we needed to speed up these debates, and we still do.
And Michael, how much coordination is there among the allies, among the NATO allies, and what kind of equipment we're going to provide? And how is it that we got, it seems like, caught flat-footed with the fact that we were running out of supplies ourselves?
Well, those are two very different but both very good questions. Yes, there's a lot of coordination with NATO. Secretary Austin is, off to Europe basically every month, as I understand it, with the NATO. I forget what they call it, but it's sort of like the Ukraine support contact group, and it meets all the time. And I'm sure he's talking on the phone frequently, even when he's not there. I think General Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, is doing a lot of that kind of coordination all the time. So is NATO headquarters. This is where NATO, being a long-standing alliance, comes in handy, because we certainly coordinate. It doesn't mean that all the weapons are interchangeable, and it doesn't mean that any of the supplying and maintaining is easy, because we have so many different discrete systems within NATO. But we at least know pretty well what they are and how to sort of deconflict how much we're giving of each. So I think on your first question, I can give a pretty good answer. On your second question, the situation is less encouraging and less defensible. And the supply chains are vulnerable, partly because we've been slow to realize you don't want to depend on China for key components of national infrastructure or weapons. Also, we put efficiency ahead of having sort of an ability to fight a prolonged war. Our military heads have been focused on Iraq and relatively short or at least limited scenarios for 30 years. We haven't really thought about high-end warfare continuing over many months. And so we're out of practice. And the American and European armed services prioritize the big weapons platforms over the munitions. The platforms seem like the state-of-the-art technology they really want to push, and those cut to the heart of service identity and culture. fighter jets, tanks, submarines, surface ships. The logistics and the ordnance are sort of less sexy, less central to service identities, and so therefore the first to go when budgets get tight. So I think those are partial explanations. The good news is we are adjusting, we are recovering, and I don't think Ukraine's ever going to run out of weaponry. And I think we'll be better prepared for, contingency planning vis-a-vis China as a result of this.
How durable is, in your view, this Chinese-Russian alliance? Is this a marriage of convenience? Is this a realignment, or how do you see it?
It's a strong partnership that I think has real durability, unfortunately for us. Although we should not view it as black and white, either or, because our goal should be to make sure that alliance, or partnership at least, doesn't become any closer than it already is, and eventually to split them apart. I don't know if they're natural bedfellows. They've got a common border that they've sometimes disputed with each other. There are some, some views of history that say that Russia's sitting on a lot of Chinese territory, or land that was historically Chinese. And, it's not clear, and vice versa. And so you could imagine them having worries about each other. It's not like, Canada and the United States or something. Actually, even Canada and the United States, we have a couple of territorial disputes, but people know we're not going to fight over it. Whereas in this case, who knows? So I think we should avoid pushing them closer together. But I think we should recognize they both feel more or less ostracized in this Western world. They both, need one big border that, for the moment at least, is reliable and safe and provides strategic depth. They both need each other's economic, assets, Chinese technology, Russian natural resources, in a world where both are being sanctioned by the West. And so, I think also Putin and Xi seem to get along, although I'm sure Xi is surprised about the war, and at least about the duration and, the intensity of it. But I think it's a pretty significant alignment. There's enough there to have them viewing each other as important assets for the other that we probably better get used to it.
Do you think Putin can survive without an ally like China in the long term?
Yeah, I think that, I don't know if you mean keep fighting this particular war.
Yeah, we don't know anything about any military aid, right? It's coming from China.
Right.
And so we assume it does not come from China, or none of it will.
We certainly assume it hasn't yet, or at least we've concluded it hasn't yet.
Yeah.
But there are some people already saying maybe some drones, at least through third parties, or who knows. I don't think there's much help yet. But if you'll permit me, I don't really think there's any realistic prospect of the premise of your question being realized. If what you're saying is, would China and Russia split apart in the course of the next few years of this conflict, I think there's almost no chance of that. So it makes it hard to answer your question when I don't really accept the premise. Maybe I should and just play along and say that if somehow we could persuade China to stop helping Russia economically, could Putin really keep the war going? I suppose it gets a lot harder for him, but he still has gets a lot harder for Putin. He still has a lot of countries willing to buy his oil and gas.
Yeah, and the Chinese can sell it, I suppose.
Yeah, but I just don't see how that development is realistic at a time when we're still ramping up our, assertiveness against China here in the United States debate, and when a lot of our allies are as well. I don't think there's any chance that China is somehow going to swing over to our side.
Yeah, or pull back. I remember a year after Davos last year, Henry Kissinger made a comment that he thought that unless we do something quickly in the next 3 months, I think there's an early summer, to sort this thing out in the Ukraine, that Russia will have no choice but to find a new alliance, a new partner, which seems like that was the case. Do you think the United States should have been more forceful or acted more sooner to prevent Putin looking around for new friends?
Well, I think that Russia and China were already pretty close long before last year. And, Xi's been in power a decade, Putin's been in power more than 2 decades, and they've met 40 times in person over that 10 years when they're rules have overlapped. They were both coming under increasingly strong American and allied criticism and even sanctions, at least since 2014 or so, when Russia stole Crimea and when China began to really militarize the South China Sea and claim the 9-dash line. So I think at least since then, this alignment has been happening and strengthening gradually over the years. And so I do agree with Dr. Kissinger about a lot of things, and I'm very fortunate. I see him every 3 months on the Defense Policy Board, and he's going to turn 100 in May. He's just an incredible testament to endurance. But I generally do also share a lot of his views that even if we don't want to grant Russia or China a sphere of influence, we need to understand that great powers do behave differently than medium and small powers. And it doesn't mean you grant them their wish, but you should be more sensitive when you're doing things near their borders. So I personally believe we expanded NATO perhaps too fast, and the idea of bringing Ukraine in was really a bridge too far. And in terms of whether there was a realistic way to end this war once it began, or end it quickly once it began, I don't know. I think that was pretty late. I would have tried hard in the course of the fall of 2021 to see if there was some kind of an alternative arrangement to NATO that could have helped ensure Ukraine's long-term security without having Ukraine actually join NATO. And once the United States became convinced that Putin was preparing war, I thought we should have used a little bit of sort of a Cuban Missile Crisis type diplomacy, where you make certain demands in public, make certain offers in private, see if you can find a middle ground. And this would require Russia to stop aggressing against Ukraine. But if we had to just give up the idea of NATO membership for Ukraine as a precondition to preventing the war, that would have been worth it to me. And that's the opportunity that I think we missed. So it was both in the course of 2021, NATO as well as the United States all reaffirmed the goal of bringing Ukraine into NATO. And I think that was perhaps the last straw. I'm not blaming us for the war, but knowing how Putin thinks, how many Russians think, I believe that this notion of a long-term vision for bringing Ukraine into NATO was a strategic misjudgment that made war more likely.
Would you say today that Jim, were you about to say something there, I think?
I'll ask you a question in a minute. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say, do you think Xi is probably the international player with the most leverage over Putin right now?
Yeah, although I'm not sure he has any real leverage. He might have influence. I guess he could have leverage if he chose to employ it. I'm not sure he has any real interest in doing that. But yeah, otherwise, I would say that's probably true.
Jim.
Yeah, I want to ask a military question related to China. To what extent do you think Russia needs military help from the outside? That's question number one.
I don't know if they desperately need it. I think that they can probably ramp up production of, dumb bombs and artillery shells and work to get their factories churning out simpler technology. I'm not sure that being able to keep up artillery shelling is going to be enough for them to win back a lot more territory, but I don't know that they're going to sort of completely, run out of beans and bullets, just because nobody's really trading with them, or nobody except Iran and North Korea. So, I don't know which particular bottlenecks in their industrial base have absolutely required imports, but I think they can probably figure out how to keep making tanks, shells, dumb bombs, airplanes, and artillery rounds without outside help.
So that leads to my second question: is the explanation that China has not provided military help so far the fact that Russia doesn't need it and hadn't asked for it, or is it because China would not provide military help even if they were asked?
I think it's the latter. I think they have been asked. I think we have good reason to believe that Russia's made that request on multiple occasions. And that's part of why a lot of people in the US government have been warning China against providing the help, because they think this is a moment of maximum temptation, that Russia needs the help. At least Russia thinks it needs the help, whatever my analysis may be.
See,
and certainly if you're Russia, you would want the help, even if you didn't have any reason to think it was going to turn things around radically. You would prefer to have the help than not have it, and that would also counter the Western narrative that half the world is united against Moscow, and Moscow, for its part, has no real friends except people who want its oil and gas. And so I think Putin's been asking, and Xi has been saying no. But we've seen a couple of these occasions where apparently, some country had bought Chinese drones, and then that country then provided the drones to Russia, and then maybe goes and buys more drones from China, and then we suspect that's actually being done with Chinese connivance. So it becomes an indirect form of China arming Russia, at least with some support technology, maybe not with lethal ordnance. Those kind of debates appear to be ongoing in the government. So I think that China's been trying to get away with a little bit of indirect help to Russia. Russia's asking for a lot more, and we'll see if it gets it.
Why does China feel so constrained to give it? I mean, the NATO is supplying Ukraine. If China and Russia feel like they have similar interests, why isn't China providing weapons?
Well, remember, I use the word strategic partnership, or maybe a strategic alignment. I don't consider it an alliance. They're not going to fight for each other. And one thing is definitely not true. What was said at the Beijing Olympics in early February of last year is definitely not true. This is not a relationship without limits. It's a relationship with limits, because China needs the rest of us to keep buying its stuff. China, is in an exposed position in the international economy, and I don't really think China welcomes this war. By the way, some people say it keeps us distracted, so it's good for them. Some people say they like Putin so much that they're glad to see him punch us in the nose, and would like to see him get a win. But I actually think that the Chinese would prefer to have the world economy undisturbed, keep their chances for rapid recovery after COVID, keep growing at 6-7% a year, and that's the world they prefer. I think the Chinese are relatively rational actors on most matters, and that's one of the reasons I'm still fairly favorably inclined to think this is an age of great power peace, even though there's a lot of wars going on in the world, but they typically don't involve the great powers fighting each other. I don't think we're going to go to war against China. I think it would be a remarkable failure of statesmanship and leadership on both sides if we wound up in that kind of a conflict, because both sides would lose so astronomically, even if we avoid nuclear escalation. And I think the Chinese know it. I think they're smarter than Putin, less angry than Putin. They still want to exercise greater influence on the world stage, commensurate with their power, but I don't think they want to just blow the whole thing up, whereas Putin seems willing to take that chance. So if the Chinese don't want to blow the whole thing up, they'd like to give Putin enough support that he gets some of his objectives and then maybe ends the war and fails to escalate the war. That's where I think the Chinese are coming from.
Michael, you said earlier that that you thought this would go on at least a couple more years.
It could.
And if you think back, let's say, on historical encounters of the 20th century, almost every war, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, seems to turn when one side is decidedly more influential and powerful than the other. To the extent that's true, 2 years might even be short term. The West seems to be locked in behind, and so do the Russians for the long haul.
Yeah, I certainly think this could go on for a while. You mentioned Vietnam, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iran-Iraq war. There are all sorts of wars that go on for 6, 8, 10 years. And it's possible here. So,
given the position of Zelensky and Putin on questions of Crimea, I can't imagine those two coming together on a deal so long as one or the other is in power. What's your view about that?
You're probably right, although, we're speaking in late March of 2023. After another year or two of stalemate, who knows what's possible, if that's indeed what happens. It's also possible that you could imagine some kind of a clever shared sovereignty arrangement, or, maybe even a trade-off where Zelensky lets Russia have Crimea, which they basically already had, before this war, as long as the Russians basically give back most of the rest of what they've got, and maybe we have some long-term referenda on certain of the regions that Putin says he annexed. So for now, you let Russia control half of the 4 provinces in the south and east that Putin annexed. And then in the year 2050, when both Zelensky and Putin are presumably gone for good, or at least Putin, you have referenda that allow people who live there now or live there in 2050, and people who previously had lived there, to vote to determine who gets what. And, you could imagine deals like that, that would sort of punt the long-term solution down the road and allow people to save some face, and then finally to stop the war. And then I've just written a paper that came out last week in foreignaffairs.com with Lise Howard of Georgetown. And we proposed an arrangement that's different from NATO, but still would allow some form of a security pledge by Western nations to shore up Ukraine's long-term protection, even after, this war is over, to reduce the odds that Russia will try again someday. So you can imagine some kind of a framework like that was maybe, because it wasn't NATO, maybe Russia could live with it. And because it still had something close to a security guarantee, that Ukraine could benefit from it. And that could be part of the negotiation as well, perhaps.
Do you fear that there's kind of like 2 mindsets among the Western allies? One that is ready to talk about land for peace, maybe the Macron point of view a few months ago, and others like Poland that's ready to up the ante in terms of the military game. Do you think there's a little bit of a lack of a similar mindset, a locked mindset? And could that get worse?
Well, there's definitely differences across the alliance. I was in Lithuania last week, and most of the Lithuanians I spoke to are adamant that Ukraine should be in NATO and soon. And that discussing that possibility, or maybe even preparing a plan or a roadmap for that outcome, should be part of the NATO summit in July in Vilnius, Lithuania. And that seemed to be the preponderant view in that country, that small country of 3 million people that, of course, suffered as part of the Soviet Union, and certainly suffered from all the wars that traversed its territory over the centuries. Whereas if you look to the West, Germany's still trying to imagine a path forward that preserves some friendship. And I don't even think the United States really wants to bring Ukraine into NATO. I mean, we got enough problems without wanting to have that fight on our hands as well. So there are definitely some big divergences. And I think you're right. It's the Baltic states and Poland. And I'd like to hear from you guys how things look from your vantage point. But to me, the Baltic states and Poland seem like the truest believers in just confronting Russia. And then after that, maybe not quite as intense just to the north and just to the south on the, eastern border, eastern edge of NATO. And then as you move westward, sort of, it varies country by country. Do you think I have it about right?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I think obviously, I'm an American, but we have Moldova right next door. So Moldova is unprotected. It's right on the border. And I think there's a lot of sensitivity about what the Russians and the 14th Army would have, being so close and so near. So I think there's a sense also that so much of U.S. forces are in Romania and operating out of this region that here we are antagonizing the Russians once again. So, the relationships go back, 200 years of lands going back and forth, and they don't feel 100% at ease. So they probably like the job done well and done it once and for all.
Right.
In terms of threats, I want to ask you about the announcement early in the year that Russia was going to be putting forces in Belarus next door. Do you think he's cried wolf too many times? Is anybody taking seriously that Putin would actually use nuclear weapons in your world?
Well, I think a lot of people have the view that I do, which is even if the chance is 1%, you got to worry about it.
Yeah.
And the idea of dismissing a nuclear threat as just simply laughable and entirely implausible to the point where it doesn't even need to affect your thinking and you can let the thought just pass through. I don't know too many strategists in that category. So it would be extraordinarily risky for Putin and he would have to do it. I think one thing we can conclude, knowing Putin, is he would only do it if he could somehow convince himself that there were follow-on steps that produced an outcome that he wanted. He wouldn't just do it out of pure spite and out of pure frustration or desperation.
Yeah.
But if he thought he could, let's say, hypothetically, let's say we're still in a similar place in a year and a half, in the summer of 2024, and now Putin's willing to negotiate, but Zelensky's not, because Zelensky still wants all the land back. And let's say Russia still has 16% or 15% of Ukrainian territory, in contrast to today's 17%.
Yeah.
But Putin wants to end the war. Well, you know, we were in the same situation in the Korean War, and Eisenhower threatened nuclear weapons use against China to persuade China to finally reach an acceptable outcome on the prisoner of war exchange issue, which was what was holding up the ceasefire. And, you know, it sort of worked. And that was Dwight Eisenhower, you know, one of our most celebrated and level-headed generals of all time. Yeah. So if Eisenhower could do it, Putin could do it. And if you threaten it and you don't get your way, then you might have to do something. And you don't have to necessarily direct a nuclear weapon against people, or at least not against a city. You could direct it against, you could just do a demonstration strike, or you could do it against a military logistics line, or you could do it against, you know, a road network where you more or less thought there were no cars, but you wanted to destroy the road to make it impassable, or a bridge. And mostly you would do it to scare the world into thinking it's time for this war to end. And Putin would have to calculate that the repercussions of having done that would be outweighed by the greater likelihood that the world would be so aghast at the prospect of nuclear escalation that it would force a resolution to the war and essentially go over Zelensky's head to get it. I'm just making up that scenario.
That makes sense.
Well, even if that one's implausible, you know, something like that may occur to Putin. And it doesn't matter if it's implausible to us. If it's plausible and appealing to Putin, then there's a way that he might do it. So I have to conclude that the nuclear threats must not be brushed off entirely.
I just want to open up anybody else who has some questions before I hog Michael's time here. Anyone else out there? Okay, I don't like to have you sitting there. Do we have? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Yes, sorry. You said you provide assistance since 2014 to Ukraine, military assistance. Am I right?
Yeah, that's about when it started.
The question is, what scenario you have on that moment you work on? I mean, because now we talk about if it's you know, we have this late military support for Ukraine and all this debate if it's too late or if it's too early or something like this. At that time, since 2014, there was a scenario when the United States should provide everything in time. I mean, for this magnitude of the war.
Well, we did provide a lot, which is part of why the Ukrainians survived last year.
Yes, that's for sure. Yeah, no, there's no question to this.
And President Obama was, of course, in office when Putin seized Crimea and started to stoke the separatist violence in the East. And for the rest of Obama's time in office, we did not provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. We provided communications gear, medical equipment, demining capability, communications, radars, logistics support, training, and not very much. I think probably in the, you know, low hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And then maybe even the high tens of millions a year. And then Trump came in, and I remember having a conversation with Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, who invited me in a couple of times just to talk about the world, sort of like this. And, you know, Mattis was sometimes a little lonely because the White House wouldn't let him hire all the people he wanted as his assistants and undersecretaries. So he would call up old friends like me and just ask us to come in and just have a conversation. And as you can imagine, it was a thrill and an honor for me. And Mattis just wanted to hear my opinion on like 6 different issues. And one of them was, should we provide lethal weapons to Ukraine? And the Trump administration ultimately decided that they should, and they did. And that's part of why Ukraine wound up with all those Stinger missiles and Javelin missiles that helped stymie the Russian advance in the north of the country in the early weeks of the conflict. So, that part, I think they did a pretty good job. And then by the fall of 2021, another key piece of what they did, the Biden administration in this case, they helped Ukraine harden its communication systems and its computer networks so that they would be able to withstand the expected Russian cyber attack. That would certainly be part of any opening salvo of operations against Ukraine if the war began. And for that reason, that's part of why Ukraine has managed to keep its command and control system intact, because the United States and allies provided that help really in the weeks just before the war began. So those are three key milestones: initial Obama decision, then lethal aid under Trump, and then communications support under Biden. You could argue we should have been doing a lot more, but that added up, I think, to around $2 billion over the 8 years.
You were mentioning the way, to some extent, Putin operates like a skillful tactician, and you made mention of the fact, or suggested it, that Trump's election might be the best news ever for Putin. Someone asked me the other day, do you think Putin would have attacked if Trump was elected president? What's your view about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't like Donald Trump at all, as you might have guessed, but I think it's still a fair question, and I'm going to be fair to Trump. And what I'm going to say is that on this particular issue, I think Trump might be right. At least there's a chance, because I think that as long as Trump was president, Putin would have known that Western policy against him was probably not going to become overly harsh. Trump would not lead the push for sanctions or for tougher military preparations. He might keep, the NATO presence in the Baltic states. He might keep the existing sanctions. He'd probably be sort of a little bit paralyzed and, not really wanting to cozy up to Putin too much, because then he'd come under enormous criticism in the United States. But deep down, Trump likes Putin, and Putin knows it. And so I don't know if Putin would have felt the need to make a move while Trump was president. On the other hand, you could also argue that if Putin got to the point where he felt that the use of force against Ukraine was going to be important, then maybe the best time to do it is while Trump's in the White House, because Trump won't really respond that forcefully, whereas another American president might respond more forcefully. So I think it's inherently an unknowable, but there's a chance Trump's right.
And when you were talking earlier about noises and whispers in the Republican Party, or at the base level, hey, we just can't afford this war in where's this place, Ukraine? How much of a likelihood that is likely to take stronger form and force in U.S. politics?
Well, I think it will take stronger form because the war is going to become more frustrating. If I'm right about its likely progression. However, I think the Republican Party, which for my whole adult lifetime has been the party of Ronald Reagan, the party of strength, and a party that has achieved a great deal of political success by criticizing Democrats as being too weak, it will be difficult for that party to willfully give up on a war, willfully lose a war, or let a Russian dictator win a war based on a specific policy choice. So I think it's much more likely that the Republicans will just make Biden's life miserable. He will have to, fight and grovel for every penny of aid to Ukraine. It'll get harder and harder and harder, but they won't want to actually be the party responsible for zeroing out the assistance. They may reduce it, they may make it more conditional, and they may develop, Trump, if he's the nominee next year, may develop a platform that proposes an end to the war. And he himself might be willing to do that if he's elected again. But I don't know if the Republican Party, because remember, the Republicans have a majority in Congress, but the Democrats have almost as many representatives in the House as the Republicans, and the Democrats support this war. So unless the leadership of the House is just unwilling to support this at all, there still could be a bill that's passed with 2/3 of the Republicans and 2/3 of the Democrats that would actually have pretty overwhelming support to give Ukraine another $10 billion in September or something like that. It might be $5 billion less than Biden wanted, but it still may be enough to keep Ukraine going.
Yep. We have time for 2 or 3 more questions. Anybody out there? Okay, let me ask you. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
No, I'll come back to the Biden Trump thing for a minute. One of the things that has never been clear to me is if Putin thought Biden and NATO would strongly support Ukraine, or he didn't think they would. What's your sense?
Well, it's a good question. On paper, Biden was always an advocate of NATO expansion. He was always an advocate of bringing Ukraine into NATO, and the United States and Ukraine signed a charter in November of 2021, reaffirming the goal of having Ukraine in NATO someday. So on paper, you would have to say that Biden's commitment looked pretty solid. And Biden also had been sustaining large defense budgets and, otherwise trying to find a sort of traditionalist view of American foreign policy. On the other hand, Putin had watched Biden pull out of Afghanistan a few months before. And, Biden's reason for doing that, you can make an argument that it was reasonable. I think he was wrong, mostly on the specifics of Afghanistan, because I think we had reduced our forces so much, we didn't really bear any huge burden by staying there longer to try to give the peace process a chance. But leave aside the specific substantive debate about Afghanistan, I think that Putin probably or might have interpreted that to be a reflection of Biden's underlying views on the use of force, on priorities for American foreign policy, on sort of a test of character of Biden as a strong leader. And Putin may have interpreted that withdrawal decision implied that Biden would not be, very responsive on the subject of Ukraine either, because this was a guy who obviously was looking to minimize American overseas engagements and refocus on domestic concerns. It's possible that Putin came to that conclusion based on Afghanistan and, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 other things that happened. Maybe the AUKUS deal on the submarines, which happened about that same time. Maybe Putin interpreted that as Biden not really being all that committed to European allies and wanting to focus more on the Pacific and China, even at the price of alienating the French. So all I'm doing here is throwing out plausible interpretations. I don't have any hard evidence for any of this.
I understand. No, but I'm interested in your perspective, because as someone who worked with President Biden over a period of years, and I was not surprised at all that he came on real strong when Putin invaded Ukraine. It was like, to me, it was like totally predictable. So I'm just interested that it wasn't to Putin.
Yeah, well, who knows? Yeah, but yeah, point well taken. Very interesting.
Michael, here's a softball for you. Did Putin lose any sleep over being named a war criminal?
No, because I don't think he wants to view himself as a war criminal. I don't think he's not necessarily psychopathic to that extent, but I believe he would say that anything like the ICC is run by the same Western coalition of namby-pamby, anti-Russian, hypocritical, US-led lackeys as most of the other parts of the world order that he detests. And he would simplify it in those kind of terms. The same way when he calls Zelensky a Nazi, and I mean, at one level he knows that's pure BS. On the other hand, he sort of half believes the underlying worldview that leads to that view, that he sees Zelensky as sort of a traitor to the greater Eastern Russian view of the world, that he thinks that anything like the ICC is run by people who are sort of caught up in their own power and who have these 21st century values that lead them to be sacrosanct and hypocritical and holier than thou. And I think Putin definitely believes all that about us in general. and therefore probably applies that to the ICC.
Michael, we're right on the time here. Listen, I have to think I had another page and a half of questions, but you answered half of them without my even asking them. It was a fascinating thing. I'm sorry I didn't get more into your book. I wanted to ask you about grand strategies, but anyways, it was a very enjoyable session. And thanks a million for being with us.
My pleasure. Best wishes to all of you and hope to be in touch again soon.
So long. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And if anyone is interested, Michael's book is available as a link from the email that the invitation email. So
Thank you.
hope to see you next time. Thank you.